To the series of virtual conversation organized by the Latin American embassies in Canada. I am Alejandro Maricio, the ambassador of Chile to Canada, and I have the honor to be the moderator today for the part 2 of the seminar, The Economic Impact of COVID-19 in Latin America and Canada, the Way Forward. Before we begin, I would like to thank our Dean, the Ambassador of Honduras, Sofia Serrato, and to all the Latin American ambassadors to Canada for their contribution in the organization of this webinar, and especially to the Embassy of Mexico, in the person of Arturo Hernandez and his team, for their hard work and technical cooperation. In our first session, we had the honor to host Minister of Small Businesses, Export Promotion, and International Trade of Canada, Mary Ng. Among other ponents, we talked about the effects of the pandemic in Canada and in the region. And today, our panelists will focus on the opportunities and the possibility for recovery and business arising from this crisis. Here's a quick reminder of today's program. Let's take a look to it. As you can see, we have 4 interesting topics with excellent panelists. After the presentations of our Zoom audience, our audience can make questions by raising their hand in the chat box. We encourage the audience following the discussion on Facebook and YouTube, because we're using, of course, the social media, to ask questions as well. Please be as brief and concrete as possible to allow others to make questions too. So, our first topic, tourism promotion between Latin America and Canada, presented by Gloria Guevara Manso, is a very important one to all our countries. Gloria, she's the president and CEO of the World Travel and Tourism Council, WTTC, representing the global travel and tourism private sector. Gloria was a Minister of Tourism of Mexico. She was appointed in March 2010 by President Calderón. Among other high responsibilities, she was recognized as one of the most influential women in Mexico by CNN and Expansion. So we're in good hands, no doubt. Gloria, the floor is yours. Gloria, you have to unmute your...
Very good, thank you, now I can. Thank you, good morning, good afternoon. Thank you, Ambassador. What a pleasure and an honor to be with all of you. And thank you also to Juan Jose Gomez for inviting me to join this session, and our friends also from all over Latin America. I have a quick presentation, and then we'll have some questions to answer any concerns or any doubts about travel and tourism. Liza, can you move to the next slide, please? What is WTTC? Let me give you first a context and a perspective. WTTC, as the ambassador mentioned, is the World Travel and Tourism Council. We represent the global private sector. A little bit over 200 CEOs from around the world. They're our members. 30% of them are in America, 30% in Asia, 30% in Europe, and 10% of the rest of the world. We cover all the industries, from airlines, airports, tour operators, destinations, travel agencies, OTAs, all of them. We have Sergio here with us, who's part of COCHA. COCHA is one of our members, for instance. But as you can see here, these are some of the faces. Currently, my chair is Chris Naceta. He's the CEO of worldwide of Hilton Group. The vice chair for North America, for instance, is Arnold Donald from Carnival Corporation that has 11 cruise lines. And then, of course, for Latin America, we have Alex Osaya from AMN Resorts. Now, this organization was created 30 years for a couple of reasons. One of the reasons was to speak with one voice. We are the equivalent of the UNWTO, but for the private sector. The second one is to quantify the economic impact of travel and tourism. So if we move to the next slide, you will see this is our data from last year. We produce numbers, and we measure the impact of travel and tourism in 185 countries from around the world using exactly the same methodology. Oxford Economics help us to move and also to quantify this data. In the chart below, you will see the growth of the economy, and it has been pretty good in the last 9 years. But the green line is the growth of GDP for travel and tourism. So as you will see, for 9 years, we have outpaced the growth of travel and tourism. And of course, last year was not the exception. Travel and tourism worldwide contributed to 10% of the global GDP, and we grew in average 3.5% versus 2.5% of the global economy, which is 40% more. What's interesting also is related with the jobs. 330 million jobs around the world depend on our sector, which is 1 out of 10. But I would say the most important number here, when you look at all the jobs created in all the industries and all the sectors around the world, 1 out of 4 in the last 5 years, 1 out of 4 were in travel and tourism. So by far, this is the sector that creates more jobs globally, and of course provides more opportunities for countries. Now, the sector is pretty big compared to others. Now, we'll move to the next slide. We were able to quantify also the impact of COVID. I have to tell you that at the very beginning, we were talking about 50 million jobs impacted. Then, unfortunately, that number grew to 75, then 100. The current scenario, unfortunately, 121 million jobs have been impacted so far globally. This is a devastating amount because, as you can see, a lot of lives have been impacted. And when you look at the impact also on GDP, as you have it here, is 3.5 American trillions, or 3,435 billion so far in loss. Now, the bad news is that if we don't do it right, if we don't coordinate the effort among countries, if we don't coordinate with the private sector, unfortunately, this number can grow. So I really applaud the effort of what you're doing and having these type of events and the coordination that you're making throughout the region and with the roles that you have representing our countries, because the coordination is key. Moving to the next slide, basically, not only we do economic research in terms of quantifying the impact, we also do different types of research. And last November, it was interesting because we produced a report that talks about the different situations that have impacted travel and tourism. So we analyzed 90 different crises in the last almost 20 years. And it was very interesting because they were grouped in 4 different types. Natural disasters, of course, they impact tourism, as the Caribbean knows quite well, and Mexico, of course. Then you have political instability, outbreaks, or security on tourism. So we analyze every single one to try to learn from the past. We believe it's very important to avoid the same mistakes from the past and to learn from the past experience. And let me share with you 3 lessons learned that we believe are very relevant nowadays. And hopefully those would help us to recover and move forward. The first one is 9/11. What happened after 9/11? That was one of the worst crises ever for travel and tourism, as you remember. Unfortunately, it took us 4 years and a half to recover. Why did it take us that long? Well, the reason was because the countries were not working in coordination with the private sector. And one of the reasons, because there were a couple, but one of the reasons that it took longer to recover the trust from the traveler, because we implemented protocols for safety in silos. Every country implemented their own. They didn't coordinate. They didn't share the same. And even almost 19 years later, when you were flying before COVID to the airports around the world, I'm sure that you will see different protocols. In some places, they remove shoes. In some places, they don't. In some places, they remove the phone. In some places, they don't. Even the plastic bag for liquids is a different size, for example, in Canada and in the UK. Now, this is years after we have come a long way. But imagine at the beginning, when people were going through the screening in airports, the experience was very uncomfortable, and that impacted significantly to rebuild the trust. So we need to have global protocols standard throughout the world. That is the lesson learned in order to rebuild trust from the traveler. Lesson number 2, 2008. This was the worst crisis before COVID. COVID is 5 times the impact of 2008. Perhaps it's going to be a little bit more, unfortunately. But in the case of 2008, something that we learned is that we recovered in average. Again, some countries faster, some countries less. But in average, we recovered in 18 months in travel and tourism. Why was that? Because we had a coordinated approach. The G20 was created. Public and private collaboration was crucial. And we knew exactly what was going to happen. Ministers of finance worked very well with the private sector, and everyone knew exactly what was going to happen. And we moved faster out of that crisis. So that coordinated approach is key. And last lesson learned is that SARS, MERS, Ebola, they were very important outbreaks, and we were able to travel without a vaccine. Why we were able to travel? Because we were able to isolate the people infected. Now, COVID is different, yes, because 80% are asymptomatic, but we need to figure out how can we travel without being impacted. And that's what testing, contact tracing is key. So if we move to the next slide, basically, these are the four protocols, or the four, principles that we define that are crucial for the recovery. I had the chance to speak in the G20 for travel and tourism recently in a virtual session that we had back in April. And this, every time that I have a chance to talk to governments, to talk to the industry, I made a point about these are the four principles for the path for recovery. The first one, as I say, the coordinated approach is key to reestablish effective operations. When is the right time? When is the right time to reopen borders? Very important to remove barriers. You will see that some countries are opening to other countries, and then we have some others that are creating what is called like bubbles, like kind of what you see in Australia and New Zealand, where the medical component is important because they were able to contain the spread. The tourism component is important because of the movement of people. And then the political is important. The worst thing that we can have is to reopen and not know who's opening, and also having travel advisories, having, for instance, quarantines and barriers. That creates confusion and is impacting the recovery. And the number of jobs, as I say, can be doubled. From 121, it can go all the way, as I mentioned before, to 197. So the roles that you all play is very important to help us in this coordinated approach. Second point is the seamless travel journey, what we call the seamless travel journey. Every time that you travel to airports, that's what is called a seamless travel journey. Hopefully it's without hassle. We believe that there are two phases: before the vaccine and after the vaccine. Once the vaccine is available, it's going to be easier because we will have just only to be able to record that you already have the vaccine and travel, have something similar to before COVID, hopefully. But if we don't have that vaccine, it's going to be complicated. But we cannot afford to travel because millions of people depend on this important economic activity. However, we believe that if through the experience for international travel, we include the component of testing, contact tracing, that's a good solution. If today you fly to Iceland, they perform a test on arrival. If you're negative, then you can move around the country, but they give you an app, or they ask you to download an app where they trace and where you have been or where are you going to be in the next 2 weeks. So the contact tracing is so key, so that in 2 weeks you test positive, they know the possible people that have been impacted. That is crucial. Testing, contact tracing, we believe is very important according to WHO and multiple experts. The third one is the protocols. To what I say, the experience from 9/11, we believe this is key. And that's why we took the responsibility from the private sector to define those protocols. And I'll talk a little bit more about what we have done. And the last one, of course, is to continue with the support from governments. We at WTTC engage with more than 150 governments. We talk to all of them. We help to share experience. And we have been talking about the importance of protecting the workers, the importance of protecting the organizations, because as our friends from the travel community in Latin America will tell you, they have no income and they only have the expenses. And you cannot survive without an income and just the expenses. So we need to work together and continue with that support in order for them to survive. And then, of course, the promotion. In the next slide, we have more information about the paths. How do we see this recovery? It starts domestic, regional, and then international. Domestic, for instance, China has recovered already. 80% of the domestic traveling has been restored in China. That's wonderful news. We are seeing some recovery here in Europe. Germans traveling within Germany or French traveling within France is been moving in the right direction. Regional, however, for instance, is between Canada and Latin America, could be, or to Mexico, or US to Mexico, or the Caribbean as an example. Regional is what happened between Australia and New Zealand. Are these corridors, these bubbles or green zones that they are called. But in the case of the EU, regional is within the EU, from Germany to Spain or Spain, Portugal, that's regional. And that's what we're seeing in the case of Europe in this summertime, some movement already and some reservations that they are very encouraging and it will help us to recover. And then in the third phase, we're seeing international. International is long haul. It's between America and Asia or between Europe and America. For instance, these flights that are very long haul, that's what we call international. So this is the three phases that we see. In the next slide, I believe we have the protocols. Yes. What happened with the protocols? As I say, we learned the lesson in a hard way after 9/11, and we want to make sure that we don't make the same mistake. So we work very closely with WHO, with CDC, and our members. And as you will see here, most of the hotel organizations and big chains are our members. I would say all of them probably. We got together, we shared the expertise. Our hotels have been, for instance, offering rooms to doctors and nurses during this situation, during COVID, in New York, in Spain, in Italy, and we're able to maintain those premises COVID-free. How is that possible? Because they implemented some protocols. So that knowledge and that expertise was included in the protocols that we defined. So here the private sector got together to create some protocols in order to rebuild trust from the traveler. The main goal is to rebuild trust. So next time that you go to a hotel, you will have exactly the same experience. If they ask you to wear a mask, for instance, during the check-in, all of them will ask you the same. If they tell you that there are no buffets because you cannot touch the food, all of them will be the same. So we started with hospitality, then we went to outdoor shopping. So far, we have 9 different protocols and they are verticals. They are per industry. So we have for airlines, for airports, for MICE, for instance, and each one, or attractions, each one is very relevant according to the industry. Then we say, okay, how the travelers are going to know that we have implemented the protocols. So our members and us created something that we call the Safe Travel Stamp. And this is just a stamp that pretty much is saying your protocols are at the level of the global private sector, the standard that we define to rebuild trust for the travelers and what we need and what we have done based in our experience. And that stamp was supposed to be only domestic, but the reality is that we had some countries asking us for this stamp. And I have to tell you, at the very beginning, we say no, but later we say, well, why not if we can share the experience? So we gave this stamp to 5 destinations. If we move to the next, please. For instance, Portugal was one of the first destinations that they were way ahead of the game and they implemented their protocols, and the protocols are exactly the same that ours, very aligned according to WHO, CDC, so we gave them the stamp. Quintana Roo in Mexico was another destination where Cancun is, that they are very ahead of the game because they had a lot of experience from past outbreaks in the case of H1N1, and we also gave them the stamp. Saudi Arabia, another country also that acquired the stamp. And by the way, UNWTO fully endorsed our stamp because the goal at the end of the day is to rebuild the trust from the traveler. So far, we have more than 45, I think is the last number as of yesterday, destinations or countries that have been granted the stamp, all the way from Kenya that we have in the case of Africa, or we have in Europe, as I say, several. As you can see here, these are just some of the logos of the destinations that have received the stamp. But it's very important to say this is not a certification. This is just assessing their protocols. We have evaluated the protocols and they are at the same level than the private sector. But when we give the country the stamp, for instance, in the case of Egypt, it is Egypt's responsibility to make sure that whenever they share the stamp with their local suppliers or the local travel sector, they need to make sure that they implement the same protocols. I don't need to monitor our members. They have done it. They have implemented the protocols. But the countries can help us with the SMEs and the rest of the industry. And I think this is something that is going to help. We have more than 100 destinations in the pipeline asking us for the stamp, and we're trying to process as much as we can. But what's interesting is that everyone is eager to rebuild their trust from the traveler. That is so important. If we move to the next slide, please. basically, this is what I have. I wanted to thank you, and now I'll stop right here and open for questions. We have a lot of information. As I say, I didn't want to bombard you with the statistics and data. I mentioned that 10% of the global GDP is the average. That number is equivalent to 8% in the case of Canada. And in the case of Latin America, it's a similar number, 8%. And Mexico is around 15%. Very important in our data, we consider direct and indirect. We consider both. Not only the bill that you pay to the hotel is important, but also, for instance, the food that is purchased for the breakfast is also important. And I'll stop right here, Ambassador. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gloria. We were expecting something like this. For us, it's very important to hear and to listen from a person like you that it's very well related with the issue. And of course, as you mentioned, for not only for Canada, for our countries too, the tourism, it's an industry very, very important. You just mentioned what is the GDP and how affects the GDP in our countries. We were listening that in Mexico it's 16%, but in all our countries, the tourism industry and all the services related are very important. And as we see that the industry begins to get ready and to be prepared to the new normality that we hope it comes as soon as possible, in that case, are good news to at least listen that the companies and the industries getting ready too. And with this, I would like to offer the word to Juan Jose Gomez Camacho, the ambassador of Mexico, who has a question for you. And I encourage all the rest of my colleagues and the audience to take this opportunity and to speak with Gloria, because I think it's very important to listen from her. She represents an industry that it's so important for our country. So this is the moment that we can talk with her. Juan Jose, please, por favor.
Alejandro, muchas gracias. Gloria, what a pleasure to have you here, and thank you so much for accepting our invitation. Your presentation, absolutely fascinating. I could spend an hour just asking you questions, but I limit myself to a couple of them. Number one, well, the numbers look both gigantic in terms of the value of tourism globally. I have to confess, I didn't realize how big it was, but also they look terribly grim as a consequence of COVID-19. So my two questions are, in the recovery, and clearly you are very optimistic, in the recovery, do you have an impression on which segments of the tourism industry should be coming back easier and faster? For example, business tourism vis-a-vis sun and beach, or urban tourism. I don't know how to classify it, cultural tourism, etc., etc. So which of these you think could start and pick up earlier than the other ones, or easier? And second, I don't know if you have some information on this. I assume that many actors, players in the industry may go out of business forever or for a long time. This might be the case probably of the airline industry. You see many airlines which are not only struggling now, but they were very weak before because it's a difficult business. Hotels, I don't know. Big chains, I suppose they can make it, but I'm not so sure smaller hotels or smaller players. So the question is, do you have an idea of how many could simply go out of business permanently, and how the tourism industry can pick up without these players, if my question makes any sense to you? And thanks again, Gloria, for a fantastic presentation.
Thank you, Juan Jose. Let me answer the first one, right? and it has to do with the segments that they will recover faster. We believe first is going to be leisure, right? People are eager to take a break, especially in the countries that after a lockdown. Here in the UK has been 15, 16 weeks, and people are eager to book, for instance, as an example. We're seeing a lot of bookings also within Europe. So leisure is first, then of course is business. And then we were thinking that it was going to be Congress and conventions. However, in China, something happened that we had leisure and then Congress and conventions at the same time, the business, okay? Because they implemented the right protocols. Now, in Asia, we also are seeing actually something that is called staycations. I don't know, staycations, you have heard about the concept, is people checking out in their homes and checking in the hotel in the same city. That's pretty strange, but we have seen that a lot in Asia. So people would leave their house and go to a hotel, I guess, to get pampered or just enjoy experience within the same city. So we have seen a lot of staycations in Asia, leisure. And as remembered, Asia was first impacted by COVID, then came to Europe, then of course went to America, and then the rest, right? This was in waves. So in the case of Asia, staycations, holidays, families, and then business. In Europe is going a similar path, but we haven't seen that many staycations, okay? In the case of Europe, it's more like holidays and for leisure. Now, in terms of segments, that's interesting as well, because we have seen a lot of sun and beach requests, a lot, I guess because it's summer, a lot of adventure, outdoors, a lot of culture, and also less for crowded places. However, when you look at what's going on, the Eiffel Tower opened this week, for instance, or it was last week actually, and they have a system to book online. I mean, it was all that already. So we were thinking that places where usually were crowds in the past, we're going to have less requests, but it seems that that is not the case, that most of the people, I mean, are willing, they want to travel, but we see a big trend for sun and beach, culture, and adventure in a way. Those are the segments that we're seeing more. Now, to your point about the industry, unfortunately, not every country and every region is going to recover at the same time or within the same time frame. And why is that? 3 reasons. The first one is that the governments that supported more their sector are going to recover faster. Why? Because the governments that had incentives and programs to protect, for instance, the SMEs and the workers, they're going to have a business community that is going to help them to recover. The countries that are not receiving the same support from the governments, unfortunately, we're seeing a lot of, especially SMEs, closing or going out of business because they don't have the cash or the liquidity to survive. So that is a fact. The second one that we're seeing is that either big players or small players, every country is doing something different. But we have smaller countries like in Central America or the Caribbean, or we have big countries in Europe, or for instance, sort of incentives to survive in terms of loans without interest, in terms of paying for the workers. Like here in the UK, the government offered a system or mechanism that is called furlough, that you put a contract in pause and the government pays you for 80% of the salary of that worker, and there's a cap. But you don't have to lay off the workers of the hotels or the restaurants, just put their contracts on hold. Same situation in Italy and France, they pay for 100%, in some other countries 60%. So we have seen all these schemes, but the reality is very complicated now to know who's going to survive. I can tell you we are all in survival mode. Unfortunately, still nothing is guaranteed. The companies that they were doing bad before COVID, they are already out of business, most of them. There was an airline here in the US that closed 2 weeks after the outbreak hit the UK. So we have seen that a lot. What's really sad is the lack, in some cases, of support from some governments to big companies. And if an airline goes down, it's not just the employees of the airline. It's the entire ecosystem impacted and hundreds of thousands of SMEs, right? If an airline does not survive, the travel agencies are impacted, the tour operators are impacted, the hotel is impacted, everyone is impacted, because in this ecosystem, we are very connected. And that's something that unfortunately some governments have not anticipated, have not seen. And I have to say, there are some others that they have measured and they are doing as much as they can to step up and help.
Okay, thank you, Gloria, for this information. And I will, before I hand over to Ambassador of Cuba, Josefina Vidal, who also has a question, I would like to recognize that I can see around the screen that the Assistant Deputy Minister and good friend of all our countries, Michael Grant, is connected. Big hug to Michael, and happy Canada Day, the 2nd of July, but it's the same. We really love your country, Michael, and we thank you for all your support. I can see also Patricia Peña, she's the ambassador of Canada to Chile. Thank you for joining us, Patricia. Josefina, please.
Yes, thank you, Gloria. Thank you so much for your very comprehensive presentation. You raised one of the points which is a source of concern to us. As some Latin American and Caribbean countries have restarted to reopen some tourism operations, we are seeing some factors that might impact our recovery. One of them, you mentioned it, is that each country is doing things its own way. So it's difficult, to have a standardized, let's say, approach, because in some countries there are still restrictions or quarantines or travel alerts and so on. But there is another factor that we, as the best of our knowledge, the majority of insurance companies do not want to accept to grant insurance against COVID-19. And this is, in our view, another factor that might affect the recovery of travel between countries. Do you have an idea about how international tourism organizations as the one you work for can influence to have a greater commitment from insurance companies to accept to cover some travel? Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ambassador. And I work quite well in the past with Minister Marrero from your country, and I'm very aware about the efforts that you have done. In terms of insurance, well, let me just tell you two things. I understand that while closing the borders, every country look at their own citizens and try to protect them, and it was very difficult. I mean, I don't blame them. I cannot imagine how difficult it is to make decisions based in little data and little that we know about this virus, right? So everyone closed their borders pretty fast. I think what we have seen is that coordination with the private sector is crucial, is very important. And we have seen some measures that without even thinking had some important repercussions. For instance, when you close the borders even to your own nationals in some countries, and I'm not referring to yours, but I have seen that in others, it's very complicated, right? For us to repatriation efforts and all of that. And I would encourage, because the role that you will play is so important, because you're a great voice for your countries, to have those bridges with the private sector and help us so that at least the reopen can be done in a coordinated way. And we're saying when they are ready. There are some countries, yes, that they have done a better job containing the spread, and those might be ready to connect with other countries, as my example of Australia and New Zealand, for instance. There are some cases here in Europe very similar to that. Now, that being said, and we're more than happy to share any data in that case, because there are three components: the medical, the tourism, and of course the political. In the case of insurance, yes, we had a situation. We were aware about the issues with the insurance. Of course, the insurance companies had a difficult time with COVID, and some of them even went out of business. Our members, we have a lot of insurance companies as we represent the entire ecosystem, AIG, Aon, and Ingle Group. All of them are our members. And we just had a meeting with them recently, actually it was 2 weeks ago, to talk about that. And yes, there are products to cover for COVID. They have defined products to cover for COVID. So if you want to purchase insurance to fly or for a specific trip, today you find solutions. What right now is a little bit more complicated is for the business travelers worldwide, because every country has different risks and is different assessments right now. But those products can be built. There is a Canadian company, actually very successful. One of our members, Robin Ingle, is the contact that's his specialty. He works with insurers and insurance companies to provide products for travel. So the solution is there. But the other thing that is very important, and perhaps you can help us as well, while the countries start reopening, when there are travel bans or travel alerts for the specific countries, in those cases, the insurance does not apply. And that's why the business traveler is the first one to cancel. Congress and conventions are canceled. And in some cases, leisure travelers, because of the travel alert. So if my country is issuing a travel alert to another country, and I want to travel to another country, my country is telling me, but I don't guarantee that something happens to you there, I'll bring you back, right? And that's when the insurance struggles. So, and those travel alerts are defined by the local consulates or the local ambassadors providing that information back to their countries. And that's where you all play a very important role. And I know that from my own governmental experience, in my relationships with some governments and some ambassadors in my own country, making sure that they had my data, they had the information, and we were very transparent and shared everything with them. And they became our best allies. So in that case, we need to make sure that we remove travel bans at the same time that we reopen, so that the insurance can be available as well.
Thank you so much, Gloria. We have some more questions. Those are from the public, from the audience, and we have one. It's made from Arturo Hernandez. Has the WTO detected an increase of COVID-19 cases in domestic travels in countries in Europe or in China? And also, is the World Travel Organization working in close daily cooperation with the WHO in tracing COVID-19 cases?
I think, I'm not sure if the question is referring to WTO, the World Tourism Organization, or the World Trade Organization, or us, WTTC, but I will take it that that's for us.
No, WTTC.
WTTC, okay. No, because the World Tourism Organization is also conducting a lot of efforts, right? And we work with them quite well because they represent, of course, the governments. In the case of domestic, okay, based on the lessons learned, make sure that we have the right protocols. We spoke to, for instance, the School of Public Health in Harvard, where we have a relationship with them. And they shared with me something interesting. They say, if you need to take public transportation or any sort of transportation, and if you wear a mask, you reduce the risk of getting the virus or spreading the virus between 82 to 92%. And on top of that, if you clean your hands with sanitizers, another 5%. And then on top of that, if you can do social distancing, it's another 3% now. If you cannot do social distancing, right there, just 90% to 95% reduction of the risk. So we need to follow the protocols. And the protocols is something that we all are responsible. If you're going to get in a plane, everyone should wear a mask, at least until we have a vaccine. And if everyone wears a mask, we reduce, as it has been said by a lot of experts, very significant, the spread of the virus. So the combination between implementing the protocols and the testing contact tracing, which I mentioned before, has allowed not one, multiple countries to recover in domestic. One example is China. Another example that we saw is South Korea. Despite that they had one situation in a bar, the rest is okay. Iceland, if you look at the example of Iceland, it's very interesting. Yes, it's an island, but they haven't had a lockdown. They never had a lockdown in the case of Iceland, but they had protocols in place. They were wearing masks, social distancing, and they had a lot of testing, contact tracing. Germany, a lot of Germans moving within Germany, and for domestic has not been an increase. The situation that they had in Germany, it was isolated and it was a meat processing plant, but not because of travel. So yes, this is not a sum zero game, either health or travel. You can have both, and we have the data, we have seen that, as long as you follow the rules and the protocols and the contact tracing and testing, of course.
Okay, Gloria, and our audience, it's very active. Dulce Maria Valles and Jose Telich, they're making some question. When does the WTTC expect to recover and return to the regular flow and number of tourists the world had by the end of 2019? And Dulce Maria, she would like to ask first, she thanks for the excellent presentation. And as she mentioned that the COVID-19 is a real challenge, if you consider that the way of traveling should be reconsidered. I know you have been going through this, but maybe short answer for them. They had the
Yeah. That is good. Thank you, Ambassador. The first one is, that's the crystal ball. Nobody knows when are we going to be recovering. If I knew that question, probably I would be a millionaire by now. But the reality is that when we look at the past and we like to analyze the past experiences, the first outbreaks, it took us 35 months to recover. The last, it took us 10. Yes, those were regional outbreaks. We have never seen something like a pandemic, kind of what we're living right now, which has a lot of challenges, but also some opportunities, because we all are in this together towards the same goal, right? The issue is going to be how well we follow these 4 principles that we lay out, and how well is the coordination public and private, okay? In Europe, we have made a lot of progress. I can tell you that at the very beginning, they were talking about corridors between Germany and Austria. They were talking about just allowing some countries within the EU to visit to each other. Finally, we talked to them, everyone talked to them, and they did a great job, and they opened at the same time within the EU, because they were at the same level, right? Within 3 weeks of difference, but they opened. So, and that has helped a lot. Now, we are not seeing that in other regions. We are working very closely with Saudi Arabia, who's the chair for the G20, to help us in this coordinated effort. We see the recovery that is going to happen, as I say, first domestic, regional, and then international. This summer is going to be key. We are seeing 2 things. In Europe, things are going really well. In the US, we would hope that they would go better, because the protocols, unfortunately, as we have seen, they open, and we have some issues there. In Latin America, is going to be interesting to see, because the south of Latin America is in winter. This is not perhaps the high season, but whenever the high season for the summer comes, it's very important to do this in a coordinated way, send that right message, and talk to the private sector. Because if you open, as an example, one country, and I'm making this up because I have no clue, but if Chile decides to open and doesn't coordinate that with Argentina and does not coordinate that with the private sector, tourism is not going to happen, right? And even if they announce it, you need to prepare, you need to be ready. So that coordination is key, and especially because the movement of people between Chile and Argentina, we know, is significant, right? Especially during some times of the year. It's the same situation, Dominican Republic and the US, or Mexico and other countries. That coordination, very important, and they need to let us know. The UK, as an example, has some quarantines. Those quarantines, in our view, should have been imposed during the lockdown, not during the reopen. Now they are reconsidering, but they are not communicating when are they going to reopen yet. And they are not working with the private sector yet in that reopening coordination. And it has been very complicated, which unfortunately has impacted them significantly. We just released the day before yesterday, I think it was, last year, the top 10 cities that people book in the summer in Europe. The number 1 was London. This year so far, London fall to the number 10. Why? Because people don't want to fly to London and be in a quarantine for 2 weeks, right? And this uncertainty is killing the sector, okay? Hopefully I answered both questions.
Gloria, I know you are short of time, but there's 2 more questions. If you're
That's fine. Yeah, that is fine. I have 5 more minutes, yes.
Okay, great. What are the chances of a new investor to pick up the business of bankrupt companies in the travel businesses? Will people make up for lost time in travel? That's one. And the other one, besides solution, global alignment, standardization of measures, confidence recovery, and transparency, is it possible to have economic trip incentives, different than subsidies, for the tourism industry, for users worldwide, and in some cases, stimulus checks to travel to certain regions? They're not easy questions.
Yeah, the second one is happening already. The Italian government, and I'm sure that you can get more information from the ambassador of Italy, can share with you. It's not the only one. There are a couple of others. The Italian government is offering vouchers to the Italians to travel within Italy to incentivize the economy. That's interesting. I think the German government is offering the same. So some countries already offering incentives for people to move, because as long as you start moving and get the engine of the economy moving, you will recover faster, right? So that's what we have seen, not only in Italy and Germany and some countries also in Asia, we have seen that. The second one is with investments. If there's a time to invest, now is the time. And we are seeing a lot of investments in the private sector, companies buying other companies. One of our private equity members, for instance, bought a piece of TripAdvisor, $300 million investment. There's a lot of money out there, and a lot of investment is happening because they know that we will recover. For sure, we will recover. We have recovered in the last 90 crisis, and we will recover. And the reason is because people love to travel. That's part of our nature. And we enjoy that as one of the top 3 things that the human being enjoys the most. So we will recover. The question is, how long is that going to take? The other thing has to do with investments. Now is the time for governments to invest in infrastructure, in projects related to tourism. Now is not the time to save money. The interests are very low. Now is the chance for governments to look for the IDBs, of the world, the development banks and other different players to look for funding to invest in projects. Because if you get these projects investing in infrastructure in your country, projects related to tourism, then you will be able to recover faster. We have seen that as own experience. I had the chance to see that in my own country when we invested after H1N1, the security, and of course, the impact of the financial crisis in the US. There was a huge investment in infrastructure, and we were able to recover in less than 12 months. And it was pretty good. And I have seen that also going on in some other countries. Here in Europe, look what the EU is doing. They have assigned $6 billion for projects, for investment in infrastructures. They know that quite well. So now is the time for countries to think, okay, is priority tourism for your country? Are the jobs a priority? Because this is a sector that is not outsourced, not offshore, creates a lot of jobs, has a lot of mobility, 50% women, 30% youth, very inclusive, reduced poverty, so increased education. What else can a head of a state ask, right? And I have to say, the only positive thing of this COVID is that finally, most of the governments of the world have realized about the importance of tourism because of the domino effect and the impact that has had in their countries.
Gloria, thank you so much. It was a wonderful presentation, and the question and answers were very dynamic. We really appreciate your time, and you can be sure that we will invite you again when we see that the industry is recovering, so you will show us figures that are absolutely different from the one that we're seeing. On behalf of all of my colleagues of the Latin American countries in Canada, we really thank you for this opportunity or for having you here. Goodbye, Gloria.
Thank you, Ambassador. And anytime, and if you want to send us the questions, we're more than happy to answer those later if there are any questions that I didn't cover. I appreciate the invitation, and more important, I appreciate your commitment to travel and tourism from all of you. You play a very important role. We appreciate it.
We're gonna share the presentation that Gloria offered us, and she also mentioned that one of her colleagues, Marisol Rodriguez, will be available for any doubt or continue talking about these topics. Goodbye, Gloria. Thank you.
Goodbye. Thank you. I appreciate it. Bye, Ambassador.
And now
thank you.
we go to our second topics. It's business opportunities with Canada. And it's also a very important and relevant issue, especially during these hard times around the world. And I have the pleasure to introduce Mark Agnew. I see you there, Mark. Good to see you. Mark is the Director of International Policy of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. All our embassies are related with that chamber and have organized different activities. And so to have Mark with us today. It's very important. He is the executive director of the Canadian Service Coalition also. And he had worked for the United Kingdom government on trade and economic policies at the British High Commissioner in Canada. I also encourage our colleagues to get ready for questions to make this as dynamic as possible. Mark will share with us his information. Mark, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for that very kind introduction. And it's good to see some familiar faces on the screen as well. So I think what I'm going to do is maybe just provide a general overview for people, and then hopefully we can have that interactive discussion, as the Ambassador mentioned, and happy to take any questions that the audience and participants might have. If I can maybe just start by saying a very short word about the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. We're a bit of a unique type of organization compared to some of our international business counterparts around the world, in that we're actually representative of three different types of organizations in Canada. We have provincial and local chambers of commerce that we speak on behalf of. We also have specific sector associations, so the Canola Association and the Rail Association and the Aerospace Association. And then we also have direct company members as well, and that includes very small, small and medium-sized enterprises that you may not have heard of, and also very large multinational companies. Scotiabank, BlackBerry, TD Bank, Bombardier, SNC-Lavalin, and many others. So I mentioned this just to say that we obviously have a very broad scope in terms of what we do, and I think the fact that we have such wide representation across sectors and companies of all sizes, I think very much informs the work that we have. And we do have a chance to work also with some of our counterparts in Latin America. I'm thinking about CCE in Mexico, or UIA in Argentina, or CNI in Brazil, and certainly we have good relationships with them. So I think for many Canadian companies, it's quite unfortunate that Latin America does, in many respects, feel like a forgotten region. If I think about the types of things that companies are coming to us about every day, we hear obviously a lot about the United States, we hear about Asia, sometimes Europe. These are traditionally the markets that we focus on, and so it really does feel like a very underdeveloped relationship, and one that is punching below its weight. And I know that it's easy to say sort of that about Canada's relationships with most countries, but it really does genuinely feel that to be the case with Latin America. And so I think the value of being able to have this conversation today is to be able to bring some attention to that relationship. I would never be so naive as to say that we're going to fix all of our issues and everything will be growing spectacularly overnight, but it is very much a gradual process. And so I do commend the group for organizing this today. In terms of, I think, the focus of Canadian businesses at the moment, it's all about COVID-19 always and all the time. And so, the reason I mention this at the outset is because I think that this presents both kind of risks and opportunities for the business relationship between Canada and the region. From the risk standpoint, obviously, it's a big distraction for Canadian companies. However, I think the opportunity for the trade and investment relationship to grow is really, though, because as a Canadian Business Association, we're thinking right now about how do we help our businesses recover and ultimately grow again. The growth in the Canadian economy is going to be very weak for the foreseeable future, and trade diversification, I think, in many respects is almost more important now than it has been at any time in the past. And certainly with what we're seeing in the United States at the moment, it's very concerning with ever increasing growth in the COVID-19 pandemic numbers. And now we're seeing certain US states are either pausing their reopening or even reclosing in some instances. So, Canadian businesses have relied for a very long time and overly reliant on the United States. And so I think that provides an opportunity to, I think, change the narrative of how Canadian businesses are seeing the Latin American region and how the region can position itself here with Canadian companies. So in terms of just, I think, a couple of very high level, conversation starters about how we could look to, tangibly try to grow the relationship. I mean, I just was sort of, thinking about these yesterday, and there were a couple that, that came to mind. I think the first one I would say is there's kind of these macro level free trade agreement arrangements. So, Canada has discussions with, Pacific Alliance, Mercosur, the new USMCA has come into effect yesterday. And, these agreements are sometimes hard for businesses to understand what they mean in practice. But again, I think they're a good initial hook to generate interest and get people thinking more about the region. Trade agreements are very complex. It does take a long time to educate companies on what they mean, but I think you need to start educating companies even now when you're having the discussions about the agreements. If you wait until after the agreement is negotiated, it's I think you've lost a lot of potential opportunity, and it means it's going to take that much longer for companies to eventually start to utilize these agreements more. And I think, and this is more directed to the to the government audience on the call, but thinking also the next level down about trade agreements. I mean, trade agreements are good for really basic things like tariff liberalization, but certainly what we hear from companies is frequently the concern they have about, say, non-tariff barriers and regulatory issues in the market, and understanding, if I want to, export a phone or a computer or piece of manufactured equipment, how does this regulation apply to me? And so I think being able to have those, conversations about regulatory issues is actually quite important, and being quite transparent about those things as well certainly is a big help for businesses. And I think kind of picking up on that point about building awareness of the opportunities, there's a lot of, I think, champions that, the Latin American region could leverage back here in Canada. I'm thinking about, major financial institutions such as, the Canadian pension funds that have invested into the region. You have Scotiabank, and those types of companies have cachet here. They have brand recognition. People know who they are. And to the extent that you can use those relationships to draw profile and generate interest in the region, I think is quite a helpful thing. It's very hard for small and medium-sized businesses to export. And what we frequently do tell our small businesses is try to find a large company to get involved in their supply chain. And that is a much better way for a small company to start exporting as opposed to trying to do it on their own. The other thing I would say, this, the previous presentation was talking about tourism, and I'll sort of say it a slightly different way, in that, we talk a lot about the people-to-people ties, and I think we say that in a very routine sort of way, and we don't actually think about what it means in practice. But I'm a huge believer that, human interaction is a very integral part of having business relationships, and so I think as part of building awareness, investing the time in building those relationships is absolutely crucial, especially when there is a language barrier in many instances that Canadian companies have. And so, having the ability to have those people-to-people ties, I think is quite crucial. And certainly, video conferencing and all of this is helpful, but it can only take companies so far. And very much using either the trade commissioner service, depending on which way the business is going, or even the services of Latin American embassies are quite useful platforms to help build those initial links. For those of you who haven't done business in Canada previously, I would say that Canadian business culture compared to perhaps other cultures, can be quite transactional at times. And so what that really means, I think in very simple terms, is having a clear value proposition is quite important for international companies that want to do business with Canadians. Unlike, say, Asian business culture, where there's much more of a long lead-in time before the business transaction can take place. Canadians can be much more kind of to the point about it. So I think trying to figure out ways to overcome that divide can be quite important. And then if I could just say a final word before I stop about where there might be some potential opportunities in the relationship for specific sectors. There's a couple that I'll just mention here in no particular order. First one would be around the agri-tech sector. The Canadian agriculture sector is, it's critical to the economy. I think that what we've seen with COVID-19 and issues with temporary foreign workers is going to accelerate the desire that Canadian agriculture producers have to deploy agriculture technologies. And so I think that's one market where, to the extent there's expertise in your countries on how to deploy that type of technology and be more efficient with agriculture production would be something that you might have some opportunities with. As well, we're also anticipating infrastructure spending by governments to increase domestically here, and that's a response to COVID-19 as as we all try to find ways to stimulate economic growth. And to the extent that Latin American companies have service providers or expertise in infrastructure, that might be an opportunity. And then the last thing I would say is attracting Canadian investment into Latin America. And there's many factors that affect those decisions, as you'll be well aware, both perceived economic risks, return on investment factors. But I think that as Canadian companies are looking to diversify their investments around the world, again, large pension funds, for example, would encourage, certainly your region to think about how does it position itself to Canadian businesses as as a way for companies to diversify their supply chains. And that's the last point I wanted to mention there is sort of supply chain diversification. And I sort of talked a little bit about diversification earlier on, but the focus of many Canadian companies now is on supply chain resiliency. So I think to the extent that in your conversations with Canadian counterparts, you can talk about it in terms of supply chain resiliency, I think is certainly a very helpful thing to have happen. So, Ambassador, I'm conscious I sort of threw a lot of information out there, but I'll stop for the moment and then certainly happy to take questions from the audience.
Thank you, Mark, for your presentation and all the information you have shared with us. I'm sure our colleagues, my colleagues, are very interested and they would like to make some questions. But before that, I would like to ask you if you have seen that, especially in the sector of small and micro businesses, that the effect of the pandemic and what it's happening in all our countries, it's affecting here in Canada in a way that it will be very difficult for them to recover. We know the unemployment rates are high, like everywhere. And I would like to ask you if the support that the government is offering to those small, because we know that the government is helping people, it's trying to allow them to maintain some of their incomes. But concerning small businesses, you can see around the city, in this case in Ottawa, many of them they're still closed. Some of them we think that they're going on bankruptcy. So I would like to hear if you, as representing the private sector and the companies that you represent, are comfortable with the support that the government is offering them and giving them, especially thinking on the near future when the economy opens and everything starts again. Are they getting enough support, or they consider that it's not sufficient?
It depends on the company. So I'll say a couple of observations about that. For certain companies that have what I call, conventional arrangements, if you pay employees regular salaries, and you have a very clear business line where you can say, yes, revenues have decreased relative to earlier this year, then programs like the wage subsidy have been fairly straightforward and easy to access. Where we hear challenges on the wage subsidy program is if you're a company who pays, say, your income in the form of dividends or other kinds of unconventional income methods, and I think that has made it difficult for some businesses to access. Probably the one program that has received, I think, the most difficulty from businesses is the rental assistance, and that's because it's not actually up to the company to receive the money. It's dependent on their landlord applying for the government grant and receiving it. And so some landlords have said, we don't want to do it, and therefore we will not be able to give a financial benefit to our tenants, tenant businesses. So that program has had some issues. And then the last sort of program that we do hear a bit about is one that just ended on Tuesday this week, where companies could defer the payment of sales taxes and import duties until June 30th. That program, again, some companies found it very beneficial. Other companies were not able to access it because if they pay the government through an intermediary, then sometimes the intermediary was not allowing the company to benefit from that program. So I know that's a longer answer than you were hoping for, but it really does depend. I think some programs have been better than others, and some companies have been able to access them more than other companies. Ambassador, your microphone's on mute.
There you go.
There we go. We have a question from the ambassador of Mexico, Juan Jose Gomez Camacho. I think he must be very happy because their agreement with the U.S. and Canada, it's already working. So Juan Jose, please make your question.
Gracias, Alejandro. And indeed, I'm very happy. I think we all should be, at least Canadians, Americans, and us. Mark, thank you for your presentation. One question, a bit more general, if I may. In the pre-COVID-19 times, Canadian investment in Latin America, excluding North America, meaning Central America to the south, even excluding Mexico, has been extremely small. If I'm not mistaken, your investment in Central and South America represents only 5% of your own Canadian investment, compared, of course, to 60% North America, 25, 26% of Europe or in Europe. Latin America, or again, Central and South America, only 5%. So it clearly shows that Canadian investors haven't fully discovered, embraced, or being totally interested in Latin America as a market. My question to you is, if after COVID-19, you see that trend changing or even reinforcing? I know it's a tricky question to you, but the effect can be both. Canadian investors may see these 600 million of people market in the South as a great opportunity to recover, or COVID-19 may do the opposite, reinforce the hesitation Canadian investors have had on Latin America.
Well, Ambassador, thank you for the question, and I'm going to sort of say it depends. So I think there's a couple of factors involved. I think one is in the immediate, say, 6 to 12 months, perceptions about risks of COVID-19 infection rates, I think, are going to be impacting the perceptions that companies have about certain markets. And I would just say anecdotally, when we talk to companies, there's I think a favorable perception about, say, markets right now like Japan and Korea, because they were able to keep the infection numbers quite low all throughout the process. I think one of the factors certainly for Latin America that we do hear about, if I can be quite honest and candid, is perceptions of political risk, and certainly there have been a certain political developments in the region that have I think had companies sort of think about what are the long-term risks in the region that they might face. I think the thing though that the region has working in its favor very strongly is there's a concern with businesses about the environment in the United States. We're seeing COVID rates, Donald Trump, political divisions in the country. And so I think that juxtaposition against the United States is what I think a lot of companies, foreign companies, would need to try to leverage in order to strengthen their value proposition to Canadian companies. So it's sort of those several factors working together that I think will ultimately determine what direction Canadian investment might be for the Latin American region.
Thank you, Mark. Here's a question from our audience on the social medias. In your opinion, which are the political, legal, social aspects that Latin America countries should improve to create a better enabling environment for an increased trade with Canada?
That's a tough question to answer, because I will not profess to be an expert in in that, because I think again it probably varies depending on which market which market you're talking about, and that will affect Canadian perceptions. So I think in terms of in terms of things that, if I put myself in the perspective of a Canadian company who is considering an export into the region, I think there's a couple of things. One is, my first sort of person that I would probably talk to get an opinion on it is the Trade Commissioner Service and the Canadian embassies that are in a particular market. And so I think being able to ensure that the embassy is aware of those policy frameworks, regulatory frameworks, legal frameworks that Canadian companies have to operate within, I think is quite important, because that's going to be the first place that a Canadian business goes to when they're looking at doing business in the region. The other, I think, thing too for Canadian companies is picking up on a point I briefly made earlier, is around linguistic issues. The reality is that the knowledge of Spanish amongst most Canadian businesses is quite low and non-existent, frankly. So having the ability for Canadian companies to understand the rules in either French or English is quite important for them, because if they don't understand the rules or have the ability to even read them or anything, then I think that certainly will be a deterrent for many companies, unfortunately. And I wish that weren't the case, but I sort of say that more as a matter of fact, type manner. And then the last thing that I would say on this question is predictability is quite important. So Canadian companies want to be able to know if we go, into the market, are these rules constantly going to be changing, or are they quite consistent in how they're applied? So that consistency and transparency, Bon, I think is quite important for businesses.
Ambassador of Peru. Ambassador of Peru. It's Roberto, please.
Hi, thank you, Mark, for your presentation and this quick snapshot that you gave us. I'm pretty sure you're going to be very busy for the implementation of CUSMA. That's going to be a big challenge for all the changes. I just wanted to ask you something. before the pandemic and after the pandemic, the approaches that your organization had with your Latin American counterparts, how are you planning to further develop? Because before that, as you remember, when I met you with the CEO, I explained the importance of enhancing the relationship between the private organizations. That's the way of furthering the business contacts, approaches, and so on. So after we overcome this current situation we're facing, how are you planning to do so? No, I realize it's very important. Many other areas, as you mentioned at the beginning of your speech, but for Latin America, how are the plans of your organization for approaching with our own organizations?
Yeah. Well, Ambassador, thank you for the question. In terms of our relationships with international counterparts, because there are so many of them abroad, we really do rely on business institutions to make those sort of links and be the forum for where we engage. So as it pertains to the Latin American region, I think there's probably 3 that we would use to help build those relationships. So for the larger countries in the region, we sit on the G20's business advisory group. So for Argentina, Brazil, and Mexico, they're involved in that forum, and that's where we use that relationship. The one that, though, is a bit more broad in terms of its scope is the International Chamber of Commerce, and they have national committees in almost every country in the world. And actually just last week we had our annual World Council meeting, and then we also have regional caucuses that meet throughout the year, and we sit in the Americas caucus. So really it's that International Chamber of Commerce group that we use to develop those relationships with our counterparts mostly. And then for certain countries that are members of the OECD, we also have links through that forum as well. And of course, the number of OECD countries is expanding, and we hope to have more Latin American countries involved in that organization in the future.
Thank you, Mark. Our friend, the ambassador of Ecuador, Diego Stacy Moreno. Diego, por favor.
Thank you. Thank you, Alejandro. First of all, I appreciate very much this important presentation. And I have just one question. Considering that Canada is one of the major investors in Latin America, mainly in the extractive sector, that means mines, oil. Canada will wait for the international recovery in order to consider new investments, or Canada thinks that maybe now is the opportunity to go forward with new investments in our region. And another question I have, I think that trade has been not much affected, and I don't know how is it now the business sector, but what do you think about joint ventures with Latin America and also about the public and private alliances in Latin America?
So Ambassador, thank you for those questions. So if I can say just a piece about the extractives industry first. I mean, I think certainly in that area, there's going to be continued interest by Canadian companies in the Latin American region. There are a lot of initiatives right now around corporate social responsibility and responsible business conduct, and certainly Canadian companies always want to work within those legal frameworks to make sure they're doing appropriate things in their operations abroad. And the reason I mention that is to say there had been some obviously developments in Canada that had caused companies to be a bit more sort of cautious in their engagement. But I think that with now some of those things a bit more certain, that'll hopefully help that going forward. In terms of joint ventures, I think those are absolutely critical for Canadian companies that are entering into Latin America for the first time. To go back to my earlier comment about linguistic issues, if a Canadian company can find a partner to help them navigate the environment, who speaks the language, knows the culture, knows how to deal with government relationships, particularly for a large infrastructure project, then yes, absolutely. I think that would be a very attractive proposition to a Canadian company.
Thank you, Mark. Now I hand the floor to Mauricio Ortiz, the ambassador of Costa Rica. Mauricio, por favor.
Yeah, good morning, everybody. Thank you, Mr. Mark, for your presentation. Very much appreciated. I arrived here about 10 months ago, and we already are working with CCC, as you are aware, with the first agreement, G2G, between Costa Rica and CCC for the construction of the terminal at the Pacific side. So we're able to connect the Atlantic with the Pacific with the pipeline. The way that you have a structure in CCC, the relations with our region is through regional directors, if I want to call them in that way. So we have Anthony Risk and Cristina Amiana, that, by the way, they've been doing a great job in our region. I ask you this in comment because the necessities of Central America and the business and the investments are different from South America, Mexico, and the Caribbean. Are you going to keep that way, that structure with regional directors? Let's say our regional director is in charge of Central America and the Caribbean, or you're going to have each time a more specific delegation of people, let's say for Central America only, for the Caribbean only, for a certain area of South America. And so the contact will be closer and the people are very knowledgeable of what our opportunities are for CCC in our regions. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for that question, Ambassador. So I think just to make it as complicated as possible, we're a different CCC as the Canadian chamber, and the Canadian Commercial Corporation is a government crown organization. So we don't sort of have any dictate or involvement in their internal structures of their operations, but certainly if there is specific feedback that can be done to help Canadian businesses, then we have a relationship with the other CCC and can certainly have those discussions with them.
Thank you. We have 3 questions from the audience. Let's start with this one. You mentioned global supply chains. There's also talk or fears about it, about reshoring or nearshoring. What are your views on this?
Yeah, I think that it's much more complicated than most people would lead you to believe. And the reason I say that is because when companies make a decision about where to invest and build a manufacturing facility, it's based on a lot of factors: the tax environment, the regulatory environment, access to third country markets. And so if a company has done that and spent a lot of money, it's for a reason. And if you're going to have them change where they invest production facilities, you have to change those fundamental economic factors. And so just to give an example, in the case of Canada, the cost of manufacturing is very expensive here. And so in order for us to incentivize production domestically in near short or in short, we have to make it have financial sense for businesses. We'll have the document coming out in probably about 2 weeks that talks about some of these issues and what has to be done. And when we talk to our members about this, it became very clear to me this is a very ambitious undertaking, and there is absolutely so much work that has to be done to make this a reality. So I think it's a good soundbite. It sounds good on social media, but to actually execute it is far more difficult.
Thank you, Mark. And I think we're almost on time, but we will see this last question if you are okay with this, Mark.
Yeah, feel free.
I think it's a good question. I applaud the leadership of Kancham in promoting business resilience and through the Canadian Business Resilience Network. Do you have any recommendations to replicate this approach in other countries, of course, in our countries?
Well, that's a very kind comment for whoever asked. Certainly, it was a lot of work and toing and froing behind the scenes to make the Business Resiliency Network come to life. What I would say, there's a couple of things. One, be targeted and be specific. There is a lot of information out there for companies, and there's a lot of resource packs and guides and webinars. And I think you have to be quite ruthless at distilling down what is most important for businesses to make that portal usable. If you put everything on there, it becomes overwhelmed and there's just too much information for a business to navigate. So be quite focused in that. The other thing I would say as well too is it's very important to have a regular dialogue with the audience that uses those services. Never make assumptions about what you think people need to have. Always talk to your members, talk to your companies, and actually ask them, what is it that you need? Because the last thing that you want to do is spend days and days working on a project thinking it's what companies need, but then it turns out it's actually not what they need. So have those conversations early to understand what's helpful.
Thank you, Mark. And we cannot finish with one more question from the ambassador of Argentina. Eugenio, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Alejandro. And also, Mark, how are you? I have one question that perhaps you go more on a fortune teller with a crystal ball, but how do you envisage the commerce and future relationship on trade with China, Canada and China?
Well, if I can borrow an expression, an English expression that I don't know if everyone will understand it, but I think we're going to be in the doghouse for a little while, as they would say. So, I mean, the reality is we're in a very difficult spot right now. The government has made quite clear what its views are on the issue of extradition. They're going to wait for the court process to unfold itself. So that'll take however long it takes. But, there is going to be a moment of political reckoning. And, we've been saying this all along. And I think now some of the media commentary is catching up to this, which is the Minister of Justice, i.e. the government, will at the end of the day have to sign an extradition order. So, whether it's this government or a future government, who knows, but there's going to be a political decision. And I think if it doesn't go in a certain direction, then there certainly will be some pain for Canadian businesses. We've been saying to the government that hostage diplomacy is not acceptable, and we support what the government has done to date on this file. And I think the reality is that Canada has limited bilateral leverage, with China. So I think it's quite critical that we work with our allies to hold the line and keep Canadian interests on the agenda.
Well, with this, we thank Mark. It was a very interesting dialogue with you. I think we all appreciate the work that the your corporation is doing, and we will keep in touch on seeing possibilities of working together in the future. And we all hope that the economy recovers and all our companies get in track again as soon as possible. And now I can see Christian Deschamplain. Bienvenue, Christian. Our last ponent. No, he's not our last ponent. It's Christian. So boosting key sectors of the economy through public-private partnership is what Christian, who is the director of infrastructure of the Canadian Commercial Corporation. It's an institution that has long and strong economic ties with the Latin American countries. So to have you, Christian, with us this morning, it's a very good opportunity to exchange some views. I know we're going to see your presentation, and after that presentation, we will open the floor to our colleagues and to the audience that is following us on YouTube and Facebook. We really appreciate the company of those ones that are following this webinar. It's an activity that GRULA has organized, and there will be another seminar that our colleague, the ambassador of Uruguay, will mention at the end of this when he closed this event. So, Christian, bienvenue. On vous écoute. Plaisir de vous avoir avec nous.
Merci. Thank you very much, Ambassador. As Mark said, the previous speaker, we are the other CCC in Canada. We are, and I'm not sure if the presentation is up yet, but just to put things in context, the presentation I sent to be uploaded was it's a very long presentation that normally when I do these types of discussions on PPP, it's a 2-hour discussion. So I'm going to try to do things in 20 minutes to leave a bit of time for questions at the end. So I'm going to go over fairly quickly over the presentation because most of you will know who the CCC is, but I'll still cover this very shortly. And what I really want to talk about is the current situation and the impact or the potential it has to help our respective economies to get started again. But first, let me just go over who CCC is, how we work very quickly. Next slide, please. I'm going to move this very quickly. Next slide. So basically, CCC was established in 1946. We're a part of the Marshall Plan when Canada decided to the CCC was put in place to help rebuild Europe. So we are a post-World War II tool that the government put in place. And our mandate is very clear. We're kind of unique, and that's why I do this early segment every time I can, because there's no comparable to who we are and what we do elsewhere. So I want to make sure it's clear for everybody, all the players, that CCC has been put in place, was created to work on a government-to-government contracting structure with foreign governments. So we specialize in government-to-government contracts. We are a government contracting agency. We're not a financing agency. We're not an export credit agency. We're not a facilitation agency that does introductions and walks away. We actually sign contracts. We sign contracts between foreign nations and Canada, and we guarantee those terms and conditions of those contracts. We subcontract them back to Canadian companies. But de facto, you are contracting with the Canadian government. It elevates the transaction to a different level. Basically, the risk, the advantage that and next slide, please. The advantage that you'll see is that we report directly into the Parliament of Canada, to the Ministry of International Trade. As you can see across the line, most of you will know EDC, Export Development Canada. We are the sister agency of EDC. EDC is financing, insurance. CCC is contract. We have a different tool, same mandate, different tools. And both of us link with the piece in the middle, the Trade Commissioner Services, which is our facilitation tool that works in our embassies to make sure that Canadian companies or foreign governments have basically a direct point of contact with the Canadian government. It's usually centralized around Global Affairs Canada, the Trade Commissioner Services. We all work together when possible. CCC does not always work with EDC. They are a tool when we need, we can leverage, just the way EDC rarely or doesn't use CCC that often for their projects. They're mostly focused on commercial transactions. We're mostly focused on government-to-government transactions. So we have our own little niche. Next slide, please. The advantage of working through this is basically our role is to bring strength to those transactions, raise the level of the standards applied to those transactions, make sure that the contracts are solid, they respect international standards, that the Canadian exporter delivering on the project will respect its commitment, because ultimately they're delivering contractually on our behalf. So if they ever happen to default or have any issues, the Canadian government is on the hook for the transaction. So it's a huge factor or benefit to the buyer, the foreign government, to de-risk those transactions. Next slide, please. So we're basically accountable for a list of things, a long list of things. We report to the Ministry of International Trade. We get audited as a government tool. We're 100% owned by the government. We were created by a law, so we're basically part of. We have the CCC Act, it's called, which is a law that basically governs the way we work. We're governed by various at financial level. Our results are examined by the government, our business practice, and basically we have the authority to sign and commit the Crown, the Canadian government, into any transaction that we deem that successful or that we're interested in. Next slide, please. This slide shows you where we're currently active. It's in various countries, whether it's at the contract level or in negotiation. Some of them we have MOUs for where we're trying to put transactions in place. The only thing that has changed from this view, and it's last week, basically, so this slide is a little outdated by a few days, is we have closed our offices in South America and Middle East, and basically have changed our approach. There was a question earlier from the ambassador in Costa Rica and how we're structuring and how we approach project. And actually, I'm going to take the time to answer that question right away because the timing is perfect here. We're changing our approach because of COVID, and basically we are looking to fast track the project delivery, the project, the engagement by project identification to contract signing. We're trying to shorten that period of time because the Canadian economy needs it, but also you as a foreign buyer, when you're committing to work with the Canadian government, you don't want this to take months and months or years. You want to get those projects as quickly as possible deployed. So we are changing our approach from the regional approach. We're having a team in Canada that does certain pieces of the project, and we had a group on the road that did other pieces of the project. We are now transaction-based. So basically, those transactions will have teams assigned to them that will focus on those transactions, and there'll be very clear lines of communications to roll out those projects as quickly as possible. And the idea is to benefit all of us to get to those projects, the project execution, job creation, economies, stimulate their economies as quickly as possible. Basically, we've reduced the amount of layers involved in the project for more direct communication. Next slide, please. Next slide. So basically, some of the projects that were done in the region. So Caribbean, South America. So actually, there's some in even in elsewhere in the Middle East. But you'll see that type of transaction CCC does. There's mention of a PPP. There's one in Bermuda that we're almost done executing. We actually did another one, and I'll cover some of the projects more specific to the region later on. But those are just some of the types of projects that we do. We're all involved in all sectors. CCC does aerospace, defense, security, information communication technology, clean tech. Infrastructure is one of our pillars at CCC. If we remove our business line with the U.S. government, and one international transaction that we have that is so massive that it skews the numbers. Infrastructure is our biggest sector at CCC. So I can say there's a lot of pressure on me and my team to deliver. It's also a sector that will be most looked at post-COVID to kickstart economies around the world, because it has direct impact on local workforce for everywhere as those projects get executed. Next slide, please. Okay, one more. So basically, how we work, we're gonna move through those very quickly. You can move a couple slides and one more slide. One more. I'm just going to keep this in one more to keep this within the time frame, basically. So basically, the way this would work, I want to just show a visual. CCC stands in the middle. There's the buying government. There's a contract that is put on a government-to-government basis, where CCC is the recipient of this contract and assumes all the contractual risk. We'll subcontract some of that work to a Canadian company through what we call a domestic contract. The Canadian exporter will export on our behalf, but CCC remains 100% responsible for everything in these transactions. Obviously, technical discussions will happen directly between the exporter and the foreign buyer technical team, but nothing gets done contractually without our approval. Money flows through us. We make sure that the contract documentation is to our liking, to our international standards. It is basically made there to raise the strength of that project by applying international standards, Canadian government guarantees. As you can see, the CCC, through the Government of Canada, will guarantee the contract performance. So the contract terms and conditions are guaranteed. So if there is any issues with the Canadian exporter, you're basically, I just lost my sales pitch, by the way. I usually say it's guaranteed by a AAA rated government. So I will say by a AA plus government right now for the first time since this change a few days ago. But the equivalent is to get a 20% performance bond by a B-rated bank. So it's still a fantastic guarantee to apply to a project that ensures success ultimately to that project. Next slide, please. So basically how it works and I'll summarize this very quickly. Typically, we do an MOU. We will put the program around an MOU, and it's not applicable to all projects. It's usually how most governments like to elevate projects to government. An MOU is signed between CCC and the host government, the buying government. CCC will perform extensive due diligence on the Canadian exporter, technical, managerial, financial strength, but also on the responsible business conduct of the transaction by the exporter. We'll put a services agreement in place, basically dictates how we're going to work, what we're imposing on the company in terms of way to proceed with us, and basically just to make sure that things are done our way. CCC submits a proposal to the buyer, basically to kickstart the negotiation with the buyer to make sure that this is properly, it's going in, everybody's on the same page scope-wise, basically. CCC will negotiate the prime contract with the foreign government. Obviously, the Canadian exporter is by our side at that point because they're the technical expert. But CCC owns that contract, so basically we are the ones negotiating that contract. CCC will issue a similar contract to the Canadian exporter to deliver on our behalf, but CCC will manage the contract performance. We will administer all funds on the project, which means all money flows through us. And basically that allows us to apply our Canadian government guarantee to that project. Next slide, please. In terms of my sector, where do you see us involved? It's basically, I'll say this, it's almost all infrastructure type projects. And you'll notice there's one thing that's missing here. It's our Canadian biggest sector, it's called mining. It's one sector we're not currently active in, the extractive sector, just because of the risk associated, and because it's one of the most mature sector we have, and it's never done government to government. There's not a real need by the Canadian industry for us to engage in this sector. So what you're seeing here is where we typically see most of our or the request for assistance, or the Canadian company is bringing projects in the following sectors. Next slide, please. Why are government exploring PPPs through other method of delivery? Well, do you have time and money, the money required to invest in preparing all the documentations and making sure that this will meet international standards? Do you have the legal system to to deliver or even just entertain PPP projects? Not a lot of countries have a very strong, rigid PPP legal framework. That's where CCC comes in, is to help close that gap, fast track those types of projects to avoid a lengthy, often challenging or disappointing RFP process that ends up in the legal battle with no project execution. It just delays after delays. We offer a unique tool that allows to jump that process and allow government-to-government negotiations. Basically, if the transactions are elevated at the bilateral level, they're fast-tracked. Obviously, it requires a willingness by both governments to do this. But for strategic assets that are strategic to your economy, it's a way to ensure successful project delivery, but also done on time, on budget, and according to the contract. Let's be honest, if there's one sector that's known to be challenged with these types of delivery on time, on budget, it's infrastructure. And that's where CCC comes in to basically provide you the assurance that this will get done. It also de-risks the transaction for the lenders. One of the key elements to an infrastructure project is where's the money coming from? Since most governments don't have the actual appropriation to assign to projects, a lot of those projects are financed internationally or through PPP type structures. Those lenders are looking to de-risk their transaction. One of the biggest risks in the infrastructure project is the asset to be delivered and the asset to be performing according to the plan. CCC comes in and de-risks that piece for the lender. So it makes it a bit easier in a lot of projects to attract financing, or competitive financing, I should say. You also may not have the bank strength or the technical knowledge how to actually run those public tenders, those types of projects internally. Some of those assets have to be highly successful and competitive in the way they're administered to make sure that they bring as much value to all stakeholders. And this is why a PPP kind of will come in and provide allows the private expertise to be brought into a project. Next slide, please. So you're looking for rapid project delivery, potentially low interest rate, you have low interest from potential bidders due to project risk financing, limited access to financing from traditional commercials, desire to procure world-class expertise from Canada that has been vetted by the CCC. You might have a preferred Canadian exporter or a solution that you're looking for, and you're looking at a way to contract with them. We become a vehicle that gives you access to this. But you're also looking to make sure that those projects meet environmental, ethical, high level of environmental and ethical business. Those standards are very high. Basically, they have to comply with our standards, which would be equivalent to the World Bank standards for environment and things like this. So you're looking for a clean deal, one that respects the environment. We become a tool at your disposal to engage. Next slide, please. This is where it gets very complicated. I'm not going to bore you with the type of details, but those are the types of PPP models that exist that are entertained. The one in red is probably the one the most commonly sought. Design, build, finance, maintain, operate. You're basically giving the contract to a private company that's going to come in, design, build it. They're going to attract their own financing. They're going to maintain the asset. They're going to operate it for 20, 25, 30 years. And basically, the government will give the authorization for the project to proceed. And the company charges a fee to the operator or to the government or to the users or to the government to collect its fees. And they're allowed to service their debt and make their money. Next slide, please. Again, I covered this quickly earlier, but those are the basic steps. An MOU, a letter of agreement. Basically, an MOU is just to put the framework around to allow the G2G to proceed, government to government. Letter of agreement will allow us to basically define the project and all the steps required, make sure it's very transparent by all sides. The development agreement is where normally we'll perform the studies, the pricing model, the design, engineering, structure, preliminary, to basically be able to give you guys pricing. And it's at our own cost. If the project does not proceed, typically the buying government would have to reimburse the cost of that phase and own all that information, so you can actually shop it around after that. But you don't have to do the initial investment. If the project proceeds, you don't pay for the development agreement. Those costs gets built into the project agreement. It's the government to government construction contract and the concession agreement, basically at that point. Let's be honest, PPPs are very popular verbally, very challenging to put together, normally they're a lengthy process. I'd say we've done a few of those, and the longest I've been involved was 5 years, and the shortest I've been on was about 2 years to put together. Because there's so many, you're transferring all that risk to a private sector company. There's a lot of agreements to put in place. There's a lot of stakeholders involved. It's just not that quick. It can be done quickly. It would have to be done duplicating something where all the legal framework already exists, and you can shorten that in an execution phase. But typically, it's not the fastest project delivery method you'll see, but it's where you transfer all that risk, most of that risk, to a private sector company. Next slide, please. Examples of CCC P3 projects. Next slide. First one, Bermuda. It's almost finished. We're basically rehabilitating their airport under a PPP model. I will say, though, it's probably one of the toughest sector right now impacted by COVID-19 is P3s or PPPs in airport construction operations, because nobody's flying since March. The revenues, the debt still has to be serviced by the owner operator of that airport, and the challenge is there's zero revenues or very little revenues coming in. So I would say it's one of those we've seen. I'll just pause and give you guys just food for thought on something here. When we had the financial crisis in 2008, Heathrow Airport saw a 5 to 7, I think it's 5 or 7% decrease in business and direct impact because of the financial crisis. During COVID, 95% decline in revenues for Heathrow airports. Just to give you an example, the significant impact this specific sector has seen in because of COVID. It will have an impact on who the players are, the rules of engagement, the rules they're going to want to play with, under. A lot of those contracts did not even consider a force majeure clause for a epidemic. Which means they're on the hook to service all those debts and have no recourse to access to any revenues. It will put a lot of those concessions in financial risk. But this project is about 90% complete. I think we were scheduled to finish this summer. So the minute we're allowed to travel and get back to on the construction site, this should be finished very quickly. Next slide, please. One that was completed, and the ambassador is actually on the phone here, is the Quito International Airport in Ecuador. We completed this airport many years ago, but it was our first PPP project. As much for us and as for the government of Ecuador, it was a bit challenging to put together because it was done in a unique way, but it was a very successful P3 project. From the asset won numerous awards internationally. It's been it's been in function for over 10 years, and it's an excellent project completed by Aecon Canada in partnership with the Brazilian group. It was one of our flagship projects for many years, and the main reason why they actually started an infrastructure team at CCC, actually. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to skip those because those are lesson learned. This presentation is about 30 slides, and I have about 30 minutes, so I have to move through some of those slides fairly quickly. We had the other PPP we have, completely different from civil infrastructure, is we're operating national lotteries in 2 countries under a variation of PPP structure in Honduras and Nicaragua, where the proceed of those lotteries, a portion goes to the government for social programs. So it's ways for government to generate revenues to help social programs. And the Canadian company basically doing this, Canadian banknote, basically is allowed to de-risk that transaction through CCC. And basically it's clearly indicated in the contract what their margins are, their fees are, and the rest goes to the government for social programs. So there's ways to do various types of projects in different ways to benefit the economy or just the country socially. Next slide, please. And this, I'll just go very quickly here. We're currently building, finishing piers, cruise ships in St. Kitts. It's the double cruise ships pier you see on the left side. The one on the right existed previously. We built the new one there, almost finished. I think we're expected to finish this month. So I think this will get officially transferred in the next few months. This is basically done again, slightly impacted by COVID. Next slide, please. Barbados, this project is it's complete. It's for a water metering system in the country. Again, next slide, please. Dominican Republic, this is with where we're going to do provide access to sanitation services, cover drainage area to basically move dirty water and rainwater down back to the ocean, and provide cleaner area and housing for a population of that affects about 300,000 people in that area. Next slide, please. Basically, that gives you guys an idea of what CCC does. There's a few things that I want to touch on because I joined a bit earlier and I listened to some of the conversation and the comments that were made, and I want to touch on a few things. In order for PPP projects to be looked at or even entertained, countries need to have a legal framework in place that brings reassurance to the private sector companies as to what are rules engagement, what are we looking at in that country as we're looking to invest some of their equity. They're going to have to carry a huge amount of debt normally for those projects. They need to make sure that they're not wasting their time and money, and they know what the rules of engagement are. So basically, legal framework, very important. Countries have various legal structures, and it's confusing for some companies, or they need reassurance. In Canada, you will work on the civil code in Quebec, common law in the rest of the country. But as we go, we have some markets that have the Spanish legal framework. Others have, in the Caribbean, will have either the French or the British. Those are key elements for companies when they look at to understand what are the rules and how this is going to be managed. Canada has probably one of the most sophisticated PPP framework in the world. Most sophisticated. We've been doing PPPs for many years. It has advantages for the Canadian companies to invest in this market. They know the system, they know the way it works. But the more sophisticated it is and the more transparent it is, the lower the margins are. So the reason why Canadian companies want to look abroad is because the returns on investment are higher than in Canada. Canada is a high credit rating. The provinces typically manage a lot of those PPP types projects, have a very sound system in place to deliver those projects under the PPP framework. The margins tend to be low. When you go abroad, it's because there's more risk. What drives more risk is political instability, legal framework that is not there or not as sophisticated, bankability of those markets, the type of guarantees that can be provided by those governments to reassure the concessionaires, the owners, operators of those projects to basically be able to attract financing, but also be willing to put their own money, their equity at risk into those projects. COVID had an impact on some of those companies because a lot of the projects were stopped. A lot of those companies saw a huge decrease in revenues. And But I will be very honest. I spent the last few months entertaining a lot of phone calls from Canadian companies looking to get abroad, looking to be more aggressive than they were before, diversify their project portfolio, because a lot of them had their eggs in one basket and were directly impacted by the situation in Canada or in one market where they were abroad. A lot of them are looking to diversify. But again, like as I mentioned earlier, what COVID did, I don't think it's going to slow down investment. I think we have even more appetite, or Canadian companies interested to invest abroad than before. What we're seeing is the rules of engagement will have changed a little bit. They're going to look for reassurance. They're going to look for some cross guarantees into those projects to de-risk some of those projects. But is the money available? Is the appetite there? Definitely. We just have to identify the right projects and the right structures to deliver them. And the Canadian companies will be there to engage in those projects. I will conclude my presentation on this and welcome questions.
Thank you very much, Christian. It was a very excellent and clear presentation about CCC, and I will ask our colleague, the ambassador of Haiti, Monsieur France Lito. He has a question for you.
Yeah, thank you, Alejandro. Thank you, Christian. Very quickly, one of the biggest risks of in executing infrastructure projects is cost overrun. How does CCC protect government from that kind of risk?
It's a good question. Let's be honest. The reason why a lot of projects see cost overrun most of the time is because the projects are not well defined from the get-go. Very little or very preliminary studies are done earlier on, which means the pricing being concluded between the parties has a lot of variables that increases the level of risk in those projects. When we get involved in projects, let's be honest, right from the get-go, there's no guarantee that they cannot be cost overrun. But the way it's driven, it's managed. The way we manage it is through the contract documentation, the terminology in the contract, the language that governs how we ask for money, when we can ask for more money, if we can ask for more money. And we put a lot of pressures on our Canadian exporters, but also on our buyers to make sure that those projects are very well defined, to not have a 20% level of risk in the projects or contingencies required, to lower this amount, to maybe invest a bit more money up front, but to better define that price. Sometimes it's as ridiculous as spending an extra $1 million up front to do a bit more studies and to prevent $15, $20, $30 million of extra cost overruns downstream. The challenge is nobody wants to spend that $1 million up front, and everybody screams when that $20 million is needed downstream. It's bridging that gap here. We're better define the project up front to lower the risks of project overrun downstream. But because of the international, the challenging for a lot of buying countries is the contract documentations you use, or often you're forced to use, or by private sector, large private sector companies, are not international standards. It's to their benefits. What we like to see, or the way we push, is international standards in contract, where the risk is shared by all parties. It's a fair transaction. It's not the big company looking at a eager to go government who may not understand contractual language properly to get married together. CCC will basically ensure the relationship between that exporter and that buyer is fair and meets international standards. But we have projects that have seen issues, and one of them, I mentioned it earlier, it's currently going through legal challenges. It's not impossible. Let's be honest. It's one of the sectors most affected by cost overrun. Of all sectors, you'll see infrastructure is the most susceptible because of you don't know everything before you start the project. Once you start pulling shovels in the ground, you start digging, you find things you have no way of knowing unless you spend a huge amount of money up front of knowing what's under at every inch, at every depth. for very large areas very often. So that risk is co-shared, but it's a risk that exists. I think the only way to mitigate this or lower that risk is through better contract language and have international tenders being applied to those transactions, not have one side or the other assume all those risks.
Thank you, Christian. There's a question here from the public. In the field of I think I will pose this one first. Anna, what do you think is the state of the art regarding project currently in place, given the construction? We've seen, and I've seen myself, the airport of Ecuador. It's a great airport. We congratulate Ecuador and for this beautiful construction. And we've heard about the Bermuda airport and the difficulties that may have. So this question goes on this way. Is there a light at the end of the tunnel concerning the situation of COVID?
Oh yeah, it's that crystal ball question here. Let's be honest, I think we'll all agree until there's a vaccine, it's going to be a lot of uncertainty. When it comes to infrastructure projects, and the idea is to getting back to work as safely as possible, as quickly as possible. As much for the Canadian economy, the Canadian companies, but also for all our economies. We need infrastructure is the main driver of a lot of economies. And as we're looking to kickstart economies, tourism for a lot of the South American countries or the Caribbean and Central America is a key driver, but no tourism happens without the proper infrastructure. The strength of our economies is often solid infrastructure. In order to get back to work, we need to be able to travel restrictions to be lifted, but it has to be done safely. We just saw last week or a few days ago, Europe lifting some of their travel restrictions for some countries. I think we're going to get more and more of those news as we go. But not every country is at the same situation, at the same point in the COVID-19 their mitigation strategy. Some countries are doing better than others, so some are much more impacted. And it's going to be a case by case which market will get back on their feet faster. I think Canada will be fairly conservative in getting back abroad, but we expect to see in the next few months a lot of those projects like Bermuda to get back to a certain level, to get rolling again. But we're at the mercy of the health situation in their country, in our host country, and those travel restrictions be lifted and those working site be allowed to get back to work with the proper safety measures in place, obviously.
Great. Christian, and there's another question here from the public. I think we're almost on time, but we will present it to you. It comes from the audience. In the field of potential opportunities, could you further explain how technological advances in the agricultural sector will positively impact this field? Does this mean that agricultural workers will no longer be needed?
Oh, that's a good question and a tough one. I can't say I'm an expert in this specific area of infrastructure, the agricultural side. Obviously, what we're seeing, what we export mostly from Canada on the agricultural side is a lot of technology, a lot of goods or commodities. So you'll see grain, you'll see potash and other goods like this, also some of equipment. But yeah, technology will definitely have an impact. It's not a sector that CCC has been involved in often or very often. And when it comes to deployment of infrastructure for agriculture, we've been mostly involved in the goods and services around, but not at the infrastructure level. I can't say we have done one. But my personal opinion, I'd say it would have a direct impact on when you can replace one machine that costs $1 million and can do the work of 100 workers. For those large farmers, it has a direct impact on their balance sheet. And unfortunately, we've seen those major large economies apply that technology to a lot of that sector, a direct impact on workforce. I think it's just, it's not going to stop. these companies are there to protect their bottom line ultimately.
Okay, with this, we really thank you, Christian, for your company, for your presentation. It has been very useful for us, and all our embassies on every one of us work with CCC. We're in collaboration permanently, and we hope to continue with that collaboration among Canada and our region. Thank you very much for this. We will share also your presentation with the rest of our colleagues. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, and have a great day.
And now we go to our last topic, and we will have to give an explanation here. Unfortunately, our Vice Minister was called this morning by President Piñera. And you know, in Chile, we have a word that says, donde manda capitán, no manda marinero. That means when the captain gives an order, the rest of the crew says it's okay. So, but we're very happy to have with us Angélica Romero. She's Director of Multilateral Trade at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So she works very closely with Rodrigo, with our Vice Minister, and she's, of course, in charge of all multilateral negotiations of Chile. So she will talk about the opportunities for the recoveries of Latin America that the digital economy offers. It's an interesting issue, no doubt, considering that Chile has just negotiated, and we will use it as an example for this presentation. We have just negotiated with New Zealand and Singapore a digital economy-based free trade agreement, the first of its kind at the global level. With the aim of promoting small and medium enterprises and ICT. Angélica, bienvenida. Thank you very much for being with us. I know you were called in the very short advice time, but you will help us on this. We're making our big effort to share with all of our colleagues and the audience. You will have the opportunity of make your presentation. We know you have a presentation, and then you can with the audience take some questions, and we will be listening very. It's a very interesting issue for us. Bienvenida, Angélica.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. It is my pleasure. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Yes, as Ambassador Mauricio explained, unfortunately, our Vice Minister is not here because he is now with President Piñera. But I am here, and I hope that I can share with you some aspects from our digital economy partnership agreement, the ones that we signed a couple of weeks ago. So let me see if I can share with you my screen. Let me just give me, I think this one. Then I go here. And then here.
Great.
That's great. Okay, so I would like to show you the work that we are doing on digital economy and explain why we think this is an opportunity for the economic recovery of Latin America. I want to start by mentioning some projection for LATAM that was released by the OECD a couple of weeks ago. They released the Economic Outlook 2020, and in that publication, we see an analysis that they did regarding the pandemic and its effects in the economy. And they use two different scenarios here. The one that is a single, outbreak, and a scenario where we only have just one way of infection. And this shows that there is an effect in the global economy activity falling in about 6% in 2020. And it also says that the OECD employment climbs to almost 10%. And in this scenario, the Latin American GDP growth falls at about 7%. And this is, very bad numbers, but we have worse numbers. And it says that analysis said that if we have a second wave, a second outbreak of this pandemic, we need to renew, the lockdowns and returns to them. So this will provoke an additional fall that it's about 1.5%. So as all of us know, the pandemic led us the most severe recession in nearly a century, and it's causing enormous damage not only in the health, but also in the jobs and in the well-being of the people. So I would like, after that, I would like to mention that not all the numbers are bad. Digital technologies are growing, and how it does occur, we have new platforms, new applications in e-commerce, digital financing emerging across the region. And I want to show some examples of the Latin American digitally intensive industries. For example, digital technology help us to communicate with each other through the use of mobile telecommunications. Digital financing help us on making the payment, the insurances. We also have the retail or the marketplaces, and that help us on buying the goods that we need. And of course, we also have this digital purchasing and online delivery that has been very, very helpful in these times of pandemic. And of course, there is also a media content that has been also useful to be connected, The World Economic Forum stated that if Latin American economies embrace digital trade, the GDP per capita in the region could increase by more than 1,000 per year. That means that it could generate about $1 trillion incremental boost by 2030. So these are very, interesting numbers, because the pandemic has helped us, saying in a positive way, to move digital technologies, to use them, to find ways where we can be, secure in our homes, but continue doing the things that we usually do. And here you will see some headlines I want to share. They are from different newspapers from our region. For example, the first one says that the incomes from e-commerce shoots between March and April. The other one says e-commerce has grown more than 300% in Latin America during the pandemic. Another example is e-commerce as an answer to the pandemic. Or the last one that says that online sales grows 119% during the pandemic. What does it show? It shows that digital technologies are growing, and there are several examples. For example, online commerce platforms have grown. One of the most knowledge, platforms registered about 1.7 million of new buyers that use the platform in Latin America. Another examples are the streaming platforms that we are using, to entertain, the banking transactions that we are doing, each day. So these are numbers that shows that digital technologies are growing and they are doing fast. And why is occurring this? Because the technologies has become a key resource to simplify the routine and stay connected. Technology is helping people to work, to learn, to socialize, to fit, to be entertained, while respecting the physical distance that we need to have during this pandemic. And it is important to mention that COVID-19 has sped technological adoption and connectivity across generations. And when physical distancing measures start to be lifted, we feel that online habit will continue, you know. We will see more companies applying remote work, more schools using the digital technologies, tools, online shopping and electronic payment. So this will continue, you know, after COVID-19. And in this scenario, it is important to develop clear rules, you know, and the necessary environment to help digital economy growth. And that's why Chile signed with New Zealand and Singapore the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement. This is an agreement that promotes collaboration in the field of the digital economy, and it seeks to establish a regulatory and a cooperative framework that allows members' economies to expand their market for the development of the digital economy. We are small economies, you know, we are like-minded, we have common understanding on core issues such as digital product, cross-border data flow, etc. And we also feel that this is a way to support other processes, you know, for example, the initiative in WTO, in APEC, and others. What does the DIPA content? What is the content of this agreement? Well, we can talk about three, you know, different parts. You know, the one that is the conventional clauses, where you can find, you know, different elements like paperless trade, electronic signature, public procurement, electronic payment, and these are the kind of clauses that you will find, you know, in chapters such as the e-commerce chapters that some trade agreement have. But there are other two pillars, you know, the new object of trade, that these clauses regulate how we will trade digital products, you know, how we will manage, for example, cross-border data flow, or how we will, you know, we will use personal information, or the way that we will locate the computing facilities. So it's a number of clauses that help us on find rules, clear rules for us in order to address these elements. And there are also new topics. For example, cooperation in cybersecurity, or competition policies, or digital inclusion, or cooperation in artificial intelligence. These are the you know, the general contents of TIPA, and I would like to highlight three elements that, in our case, we feel it's very, very important. One of them is digital inclusion. We feel that it's very important that all people can benefit from digital economy, and that's why we have a module that enhances activities to help expand e-commerce to the society. And how do we do it? Cooperation, you know, we will cooperate by sharing experiences, best practices, exchange of experts, and to address, you know, barriers that can, you know, difficult the access of the digital economy. The other element that we would like to, you know, to highlight is trade facilitation. We feel that this is an important element. We need to reduce the number of documents, reduce the processes time, you know, establishing clear regulation, applying program interface. So we have different elements that will help on facilitating the development of express shipment in order to promote this digital economy. And the third key element for this agreement is SMEs. You know, for SMEs, we would like to share information how they can benefit of this agreement, how they can use it in an easy and accessible way. And for that reason, we will have in our website information, you know, in order to support the SMEs to use this tool, you know, and facilitate the process of international trade. In other words, one of the main objectives is to support the SMEs, to have this module to promote cooperation, And DIPA establishes clear rules, cooperation, innovation, all these to keep a free digital market. What are the institutional aspects that have DIPA, that DIPA has? The first of all, that is open to the accession of new members. This is something that we have, the only thing that is needed is that the DIPA, we can access new members once the DIPA enters into force. There is a joint committee that will be able to adopt that decision and give a deadline to the candidate to deposit the accession instrument. And the DIPA will enter into force 90 days after, the date on which two signatories have ratified the agreement. That is also an important, well, I don't know if it's important, but I would like to highlight it. This is the first agreement that we signed electronically. In fact, the ministers that subscribed this agreement did it through e-sign because we recognize the electronic signature, that bears the same legal effect as a traditional signing. I would like also to share with you another, work that we are doing in the Pacific Alliance, and is the regional digital market that we are working with our partners in Pacific Alliance, and also with the CLAC and the Inter-American Development Bank. This is a market, a mechanism that we would like to have in order to allow the free flow of digital products, goods, and services, and expand the opportunities to MSMEs through the elimination of barriers and the use of digital tools. In other words, we would like that the MSMEs has the same condition, that they have in the country, in their own country. They can find the same conditions in another Pacific Alliance country. What are the objectives of this regional digital market? Well, accessing to the international trade, and also promote the development of local content. There is, several sectors that have local content. For example, the creative industries, and we would like to promote the development of this sector by using this regional digital market. We also would like to encourage in services and digital products, enabling conditions for technological investment, and of course, having the chance to insert MSMEs in the global value chain. I would like to mention that to fulfill this objective, we have also three pillars. The first pillar that we are working is to promote the establishment of the infrastructure. It is very, very important to have a good infrastructure in order to enable, the regional flow, the storage, the processing of the data, etc. The second pillar is to promote the establishment of regulation, and standard. For example, technical interoperability, cybersecurity, seals of certificates of approval, mutual recognition of electronic certificates, among others. And the third pillar is the one that I expressed before, is strengthening the availability of content of regional relevance, the local content. It's important to support the sectors that creates content in the region, and for that reason, we would like to support them with this regional digital market. Why we are doing this in the Pacific Alliance? Because we have in our trade agreement, we have e-commerce and telecommunication chapters. So we have, a baseline in order to work together. And because we also have the digital agenda for Latin America and the Caribbean, this is something that is important. It's a conference, a ministerial conference that we we do, in the region, and it's a space where we can share experience and learn from others. What are the steps? Where are we in this regional digital market? Well, we finalized the art of the regional digital market. As I mentioned, we have the support of the CLAC and the Inter-American Development Bank. And right now, we are in the process of the elaboration of the strategy. We hope that we will finalize it at the end of October, beginning of November, and we will present this strategy, in the summit that the president will have, the president of Pacific Alliance will have in December 2020. What are the challenges that we have ahead? Well, we feel that the mitigation of the effect of the pandemic is the top priority for all of us, and we need to act, in order to seize the opportunity that the digital economy could give us. So, in our perspective, the digital economy should supersede the economic recovery process. A varied array of measures and action that strengthen the SME's participation in digital economy will, of course, be essential in order to, undertake this pandemic that we have here and all the impacts that we have been having in order in the economic aspects. Once the DEPA enters into force, we will work in implementing it and fulfilling its objective. We also want to have future accession. We will promote the agreement and see if other partners, countries want to join us in order to, work on digital economy. Our countries will continue the effort in the regional integration through the regional digital market that I have already explained to you. And we hope that we can embrace, the adoption of new tools, new digital tools. We feel that the digital economy is something that is going to stay here, and we need to work together in order to have this clear rule to have, the development of this market. And we also feel that regulation is important, and for that reason, we are going to work, in order to foster a sustainable and inclusive economic development. That was my presentation, Ambassador. I am open to the questions that you or the audience could have, and I hope that I'll be, certainly not very general, but also give some details on the work that we are doing here in the Vice Ministry.
Muchas gracias, Angelica. Thank you so much for this presentation. I would like to let you know that some of my colleagues are asking for this presentation and the others. We will share the presentation of tourism and of course this one. We have already provided the one that CCC presented. So let's start by, and muchas gracias, Angelica. Thank you so much. It's a very important topic and an issue that everybody is really interested in. And we will take the first question from the ambassador of Argentina, Eugenio, por favor.
Angélica, muchas gracias. Presentación de lujo. Let's go into English because I don't know if there are some other people on the audience that go into English. I have two questions. One, very simple. As far as I understood during your presentation, this will be also open for non-members of the Pacific Alliance. So that's to confirm with your nodding, it's okay. My second one goes into the question of regulations, and especially on the need that states that will join this particular endeavor will have to align to a certain extent to have coherence in some of the issues dealing with consumer protection, dealing with the question of fiscal and customs, etc. How do you envisage those specific elements that normally in e-commerce are two of the main, if not complicates, hard issues? Gracias, Angelica.
Yes, thank you very much for the question. I have a follow-up question. The first one is that is open. You are referring to DIPA or to the MRD?
To the network or the hardcore issue that you are going to have within the members of the alliance. So if that will be open.
Okay. Yeah, okay, thank you. Because DIPA is open to other members, you know, to other countries. Right now, we are working in a specific alliance, you know, in the MRD, and we would like to develop this strategy and implement the strategy since the next year, you know, and see ways in where we can work with others. But this is something that is in the future. It is not. It is not being discussed, you know, in the group, because they are now focusing the efforts on having the strategy, and we are using, as I expressed before, we are using, you know, our chapter in telecommunication and also in e-commerce in order to use it as a baseline and see what else do we need to promote this regional market, digital regional market, because we feel that now the digital technologies are growing, and we can help us on that everyone can access on this digital to this digital technology if we have clear rules and we have all these elements that I explained to you before. That is, for example, mutual recognition of electronic signature or others, you know. Regarding the second question on regulation, and I'm going to refer here to DIPA, because I feel that this is the question for DIPA. In fact, yes, we feel that you know, the member that is going to join us needs to share with us, you know, some certain elements, but we also understand that there are regulations that could not be fitted, you know, in the moment. And of course, this is something that we need to discuss with the other partner. That's why the joint committee, it's important. The role of the joint committee is important here, because they will help to the partner that wants to get into DIPA. What do we need to do, you know, together in order to join DIPA? You know, that's important. I think that there are certain, if you see the text that is already in our website, it's in English. We are going to put it in Spanish shortly. But if you see, there are a lot of elements that mention cooperation, you know, that looks for sharing of experiences and best practices. So we need to work with the partner who wants to join in order to see which are the, you know, the elements that they need help in order to be part of DIPA and to be aligned, you know, with those regulations or wherever we need, you know. It depends on the country, of course.
Muchas gracias, Angelica. Thank you so much. The audience is very active, so get ready.
Wow.
Today there is a discussion. Today there is a discussion about who will provide 5G. Do you have a view on how this will impact on digital economy?
Well, 5G, it's an important element. Of course, I mentioned in my presentation that infrastructure is a key element, you know. And if in the work that we are doing in the regional digital market, one pillar is the infrastructure, and of course 5G, it's important. It will certainly help, and but I feel that as we are working now, the infrastructure could help, and it has been proved, with this pandemic, that we certainly are prepared, and we have, of course, challenges that we are facing, but the region is prepared to work with the digital technologies, and the numbers shows that we have been, prepared on that. Of course, we have challenges. Of course, we do. But I feel, of course, that 5G will certainly help on this direction.
Yeah, we all agree. We think 5G will be fundamental on this area. There's another question from the audience, Angelica. Which is the impact of digital trade on unemployment? Are we creating unemployment by buying online?
That's a very good question. That's a very good question, because it's certainly there is a global discussion on digital trade, or artificial intelligence, and digital technologies, and the jobs. We feel that it's important to prepare people to have the capabilities, the capacity building necessary to support the people to find these new jobs. We need new skills here. And that's why education is important, and that's why, for example, in DIPA, we have elements that will help us, in the cooperation on artificial intelligence and other that we have in DIPA will certainly help on and have the opportunity to give these skills to the workers. I have here in the seminar two experts that were negotiating DIPA. So maybe, I don't know if Piero, if you would like to jump in to complement my answer. But DIPA is when we discussed this issue, we were concerned, and we tried to capture, this concern on the jobs, the capacity building that the workers need, the digital skills that they need, and that's why the third pillar, the third content that I showed in my presentation goes, on that direction. I don't know, Piero, if you would like to jump in. If not.
Yes. Well, you said the main proposal of DIPA regarding that. Our main focus was to support the SMEs, and a lot of the articles aim to give the entrepreneurs, the startups, a way to innovate. For example, the data issues, the open data, we have a whole chapter or module about SMEs. So it's one of our main focus. And maybe to add to the previous answer, yes, we try to cover issues about infrastructure, but we always try to be very technology agnostic. Because in our research or technical research, 5G is an important part of the new developments, but it's not one of the main developments. We need to think that next step will be 6G, 7G, because the G is the generation, not the technology. So we try to be very technology agnostic to prepare this agreement to work in the future as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Pedro. Thank you.
Thank you, Piero. Gracias, Angélica. We still have a few questions here. I'm going to try to.
Of course.
And I ask the audience to be patient. How do you see the normative and legislative process to get aligned with the digital commerce and services? For example, with the electronic signature versus the public notary tradition. And I think okay, go ahead if
that is a very good question also, and I think and I feel that the countries and the economies will be, working towards having the regulations that we need in order to support all this digital technology, the digital accession that we have right now. Sometimes the regulatory framework is a little bit behind, the technology, and that is the challenge that we have faced, in all the countries, because on one side you need to regulate, you need to protect, not only to protect the data, but also to have the security, in order to avoid any chance that you will, be affected others. So that is very, very important. And on the other side, you've got, the willingness of the people to use, these websites, these mechanism, the technology. So it's a challenge for the congresses in the region and in the whole world, So we need to work towards those regulations, the laws, the regulations that we need in order to, on one side, secure the information and all the elements that are important to be secured, and to advance, with all the technologies and the innovation that we have.
Okay, I think here we have the last question because we're 2 minutes ahead of schedule. Mexico has just imposed IVA, VAT, to digital purchases. Do you think this is a good decision to give impulse to the economy? Digital purchases.
Digital.
Compras digitales, el impuesto que le aplica a México.
Okay, I'm going to say that in our case, we are not doing, we are not applying this kind of taxes. We are only applying, the normal taxes that we have. And there is this element is also considered in DIPA. The person could see in details in DIPA. So in our case, at least, we don't have this kind of taxes, and this is a matter that is discussed in our Ministry of Finance. So this is my answer.
Thank you very much, Angélica. You did it even better than Rodrigo. We really appreciate your time and.
I support the gender aspect, so that's great.
That's right. We know that you were just informed this morning that you had to be with us, and you did it wonderful.
No, please.
También. And now I will leave the floor to our esteemed and dear colleague, the ambassador of Uruguay, who will give his closing remarks. Please, por favor, Martín Vidal. The floor is absolutely yours. You're the boss now.
Last but not least, muchas gracias, Alejandro. Thank you, everybody, especially the Embassy of Mexico and Embassy of Chile in this case today for bringing together a brilliant panel to talk about different aspects that we are dealing with in order to leave this situation caused by the pandemic. There are so many things that were of such importance said today. But if I try to bring together all these comments and presentations that were all brilliant and very educational. I will say that there are two concepts that are in the bottom of and are in the umbrella of everything that was said. And these two concepts that come to my mind are coordination and trust. Trust plus confidence. We heard over the last four panelists many references to opportunities, to challenges, strong points that the region has during this pandemic, weak links, but the need to coordinate and the need to recover or to build trust among partners is crucial in order to come out from this pandemic stronger than we were before. So in the first panel from Madam Gloria Guevara, we heard great and very clear examples of how coordination is important to avoid silos. And she cited very important work that the World Tourism and Travel Council made in order to study lessons learned from 3 previous crises that the world had to face in the last 20 years. These are invaluable lessons learned that we should all take into account, not only for this sector that is so important for Latin America and the Caribbean, but internationally. So try to harmonize standards and coordinate between governments, international organizations, and private sector organizations is key to rebuild the confidence and trust of the tourists in this case, but in general of consumers. In the second panel, we had a very enlightening presentation by Mark Agnew from the Canadian business perspective, and this is something that we have to take into account many of his very open and bold remarks about how the Canada business community perceives and sees Latin American region. He talked about things that are difficult to recognize, but we have to take into account, like political risk, the perception of political risk, the importance the Canadian business community attaches to the environment. These are key issues for our countries and our companies to take into account in order to build this trust and the coordinated effort that we need to address. He mentioned something that is very key about trade diversification and sent a message that we like very much to hear our counterpart from the government. So it's very much aligned about the importance, even now more than before, of trade diversification for Canada and here countries from both sides of the continent, from the Pacific Alliance and Mercosur, are very happy to hear this. Of course, Mexico in the NAFTA 2 or CUSMA or TMEC, also in the same line. He mentioned interaction, people to people. Yes, this is building trust and it's very important. In the third panel, Christian de Champlain, representing CCC, brings an excellent example of bringing trust and coordination together because they work with public and private partnerships. And this issue is very important, especially concerning infrastructure. It is one of the opportunities that all the panelists see as physical infrastructure or digital infrastructure, as very well was pointed by Angelica Romero in the last panel. So the PPPs through CCC bring us a very good example of how to, from the government side, how to bring to the equation more trust, more legitimacy, and predictability for the business community in order to move ahead in these very difficult times. And it's good that some of the examples that were cited were connected to sectors that were presented today, like the tourism with the cruise ship piers in St. Kitts and Nevis, and the agri-tech applications in order to increase the efficiency of agricultural productions. It was an excellent way to finalize, I think, with Angelica Romero presentation, because give us a lot of hope about the future. Concerning one of the winners of this pandemic has been the digital economy, with 300% increase on e-commerce during this past months. Chile is leading the way in the region. I'm coming from a country that also attaches a lot of importance to the digital economy through the Digital Nations partnership with Canada and other countries in the world, including Mexico in Latin America. So we will follow Chile's lead on this, and hopefully, as Eugenio from Argentina asked, we will all be interested in considering accession to this treaty. So to sum up, Alejandro, more collaboration and more multilateralism is a key way for more coordination and trust. And what a good way to end this fantastic series of presentation. Next week, next Thursday at 9 a.m., we'll have a chance to listen to the permanent representative of Mexico to the WTO. So we will see that, and from the chief economist from Global Affairs Canada, and to put all these conceptual perspectives into a very concrete example, like will be presented by a chief executive from Vale. So we will see from the macro to the micro level these concepts in action. So just to invite everybody that was watching this today to come back next Thursday at 9 a.m. for the final webinar on this fantastic series. So see you next week.
Thank you so much to everyone, and we all see you on next week. Bravo.
Le espero que se